Special thanks to Rosetta Stone for sponsoring today's video. The world of Bleach is vast. The cast of characters is almost overwhelmingly enormous, full of diverse and interesting faces, blending slick designs with impossibly cool and creative abilities at every turn. And yet, one of the most important and consistently relevant of these characters remains almost completely unseen at all times, rarely mixing nor interacting with any of the many faces we just mentioned, save for one. In that sense, this character exists both on the fringes of the world of Bleach and at its very nexus simultaneously. An immaculate and yet completely unique perspective. There's something fascinating about the insular world of the Zanpakuto spirit, a world totally bespoke to each individual Shinigami and yet utterly closed off from the rest of Bleach's vibrant universe. It's a world within a world, of which there are thousands out there, and we as readers are privy to just the one. Horizontal skyscrapers and bright blue skies are the iconic backdrop of Ichigo's inner world, the familiar home of Zangetsu, the mysterious being at the core of Ichigo's power, and perhaps the most important character in all of Bleach, aside from maybe Ichigo himself. But it's a mistake to think that Zangetsu merely reflects Ichigo's ability, when in reality, his appearance denotes so much more than that. Whether Zangetsu here refers to White Ichigo, the seemingly malevolent inverse reflection of our main character himself, or the Old Man, a shadowy bespectacled figure cloaked in rippling black power, it doesn't matter. To Ichigo's end, they are one and the same, and it would be more accurate to say they are at the very core of Ichigo himself, his very soul. As far as character analysis videos go, this one is definitely overdue. Ichigo has been the focus of so many discussions on this channel, rightly so, over the years, but Zangetsu is a key part of him. And yes, in today's character analysis, we will be covering all forms of Zangetsu across the story, from White Ichigo to White Tensei and everything in between. While they are technically different entities, with only one of them truly being Zangetsu himself, insofar as representing Ichigo's Zanpakuto, Ichigo ultimately considers them all to be Zangetsu by the time his character growth comes full circle during The Blade Is Me, the single most crucial development in Zangetsu's own personal arc, as well as Ichigo's. And since they are him, that effectively makes what he says so, which is good enough for me. So in today's video, we'll be taking a look at the one character who has always been by Ichigo's side. Not as a partner, nor a friend, nor a weapon, nor a tool, but as a part of Ichigo himself. The key central dynamic between a Shinigami and their Zanpakuto is a vital and oft misunderstood one, even within the series itself, and we'll take a look at how Kubo explored that relationship, how he evolved it, and how it took on a life of its own. We'll look at the clues Kubo littered throughout Bleach as to Zangetsu's true nature, and how it all comes full circle in the end to create, in my opinion, one of the most convoluted, and yet at the same time, both ambitious, successful, and satisfying character arcs in Bleach. Without further ado, let's dive in. So, who is Zangetsu? Well, that's a big question. Zangetsu is Ichigo. Zangetsu is Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirit, but he's also the source of Ichigo's hollow powers, a fusion of both inherited from Ichigo's father. But Zangetsu is also a representation of Ichigo's Quincy powers inherited from his mother. And at the same time, in one of the series' biggest twists ever, Zangetsu is Yhwach. There's a lot going on here before we even really get started. Also, somehow Zangetsu is Ichigo's Bankai spirit too. Yeah, we'll tackle that one a bit later, as the existence of Tensor Zangetsu still feels like the strangest piece in this puzzle to me, the one that doesn't quite fit. Zangetsu is both the king and the horse, the one who guides Ichigo and helps him grow, while also acting as his sword. Zangetsu is a big part of what makes Ichigo feel so unique among the world of Bleach. Recently I made a video looking at the few dual Zanpakuto of the series, and how in reality Zangetsu was the only true one in existence. White and the old man floating behind Ichigo, their power and essence reflected in the blades of his newly forged true Shikai, are evidence of that fact. No one else quite has what Ichigo has. Two completely separate spirits existing within the same soul, technically totally unconnected, yet finally, as of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, working in harmony, finding some balance within the turbulence that is our main character. And that helps to make Ichigo special, it helps him to stand out. Each incarnation of Zangetsu has played a different role in Ichigo's life, in his development, and while Zangetsu doesn't have a huge role in the wider story, barely appearing throughout Bleach's 686 or so chapters, he does hold a deeply personal and intimate position, one that allows for a lot of introspection. Old Man Zangetsu is the longest running of the incarnations of Ichigo's power, and to date is most likely the figure people think of when they hear the name Zangetsu, even with everything that's transpired. With a chapter lifespan stretching from chapter 63 right the way through to chapter 542, the old man has been by Ichigo's side through many of his fiercest battles. Though interestingly, Old Man Zangetsu essentially disappears after the Soul Society arc. I feel like people tend to forget that, but when you look at the bigger picture, with White essentially taking the spotlight in the Arrancar arc, Old Man Zangetsu vanishes, only reappearing in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc just to then disappear once again. Of course, the truth is that the old man has been suppressing Ichigo's true power this entire time, subjugating White and forcing him to heal, and it's only in the Arrancar arc that White begins to fight for some semblance of control. Speaking of White, he is the second longest serving of Ichigo's many spirits, with a chapter lifespan running from chapter 110 to chapter 542. Despite being a major antagonistic force during the first third of the Arrancar arc, and then returning again to plague Ichigo later on after his battle with Ulquiorra, White is in fact Ichigo's true Zanpakuto spirit. A mix of his Shinigami and Hollow powers, who was set free during the Soul Society arc once Isshin's hold over White, or should I say his hold over the vestiges of the original incarnation of White that spread the virus of hollowification, finally broke after 20 years, creating a perfect hybrid totally unique to Ichigo himself. Although introduced into the series as Ichigo's dark reflection, an embodiment of evil lurking within our main character, who represented Ichigo's raw, instinctual lust for both battle and power, White has always protected Ichigo, rescuing him from the jaws of death against Byakuya, and then resurrecting him after death in the battle with Ulquiorra. White is a fascinating character, and in my opinion, the most interesting of the residual spirits housed within Ichigo's soul. The reveal of his true nature felt like a retcon to some degree, but at the same time, the evidence was always there. It's incredible. It's almost like we were so attached to the partnership between Ichigo and the old man that we couldn't see the forest for the trees. It still is, in my opinion, some of Kubo's smartest writing, potentially upending the foundation of the entire series. I do wonder what was going through Kubo's mind when he penned the Zangetsu twist. It must have been nerve-wracking. How would something of this magnitude be accepted, or if it even would be, by the audience? It was a huge gamble at the time as to whether or not audiences would take on such a thing, but I think it ultimately worked. Then we have Tensa Zangetsu, a younger version of the old man, who is in reality a reflection of a much younger Yhwach. And yet here, this spirit is meant to represent Ichigo's Bankai. And this is the part I have the most trouble with. This is the part that I feel is the stickiest, that Kubo himself probably had the toughest time writing around. Don't get me wrong, I really like the revelation that Yhwach looked like Tensa when he was a young man. That's very clever, and really the only way of realistically tying this together. But the existence of a Bankai-specific spirit doesn't really feel like something you can gloss over, especially when Kubo all but confirmed they do actually exist with the existence of Yachiru. If Zanpakuto have separate spirits for their Bankai, why doesn't White look any different when Ichigo faces him during Deicide? Sure, he's wearing Ichigo's Bankai at the time, but is that really the extent of his change? That's not a separate spirit akin to what Tensa Zangetsu is supposed to be. On the other hand, why even bother transforming? It's not like Ichigo knew there was meant to be a different spirit for his Bankai, so why did Zangetsu go to the trouble? Especially considering he is Ichigo's Quincy power, therefore this is something entirely of his own invention. Tensa Zangetsu's existence is, to me, the biggest indicator that Kubo had originally planned for the old man and this new incarnation to be the source of Ichigo's Shinigami powers as intended from the start. I feel like I'm struggling to explain myself a bit, but there's a lot going on here. I also remember people being a little disappointed in Tensa Zangetsu when he first appeared, because it felt like Zangetsu's awesome and totally unique design had been traded in for something a little more generic, though I like how Tensa looks personally. He's not around for particularly long, with a chapter lifespan running from chapter 409 to chapter 411, at which point he then becomes one with White to take on the form of Ichigo's true power, colloquially known as White Tensa, who then lasts from chapter 411 to chapter 421. As for Zangetsu's visual design, well, the old man definitely has my favourite look of the bunch. Equal parts rugged and stylish, Old Man Zangetsu feels shadowy and ethereal, his form mostly obscured beneath his flame-like cloak, which is often depicted as billowing or flowing like a ghostly veil of darkness. The addition, however, of the orange-tinted shades is so typical of early Bleach, and feels incredibly nostalgic. It's that hint of the zany that completes the look, adding to it without taking away from the serious demeanour of the character. If anything, the shades are somewhat diminished by the time we reach the 1000-Year Blood War arc, when Kubo's style is less angular and more rounded and more realistic, and now they feel like a less striking accessory overall. It's the sort of design element that was missing from later characters as the series kind of grew up with its audience in a sense, and that makes the old man feel like he comes from a bygone era. Like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't help either that he disappears between the Soul Society arc and the 1000-Year Blood War arc. But in the end, Old Man Zangetsu combines the slick elegance of Kubo's best work with just a hint of the wild to really help him stand out. One of the best things about Yhwach's later transformation as he's coated in the Soul King's power is the way Kubo used it to call back to the old man's design, effectively turning Yhwach Arc into a stand-in for Zangetsu during the final battle. It's really cool and helps bring Ichigo's journey full circle in a way no one really expected. And then there's White, a mirror image of Ichigo himself, transformed by a monochromatic colour scheme and hollow-like eyes. Some incarnations of the character even give him a blue tongue, which I always thought looked very cool personally. Now, it's possible that some may find White's design to be a little uninspired, maybe even cliché. After all, he's the prototypical dark version of a hero, their shadowy other half, the other side of the coin, them in almost but not quite every way. And that is true. Despite his snow-white hair, pale appearance, and white shihakusho, White does look just like Ichigo. But that's kind of what I like most about his design. Through White, we get to see another side to Ichigo that we otherwise wouldn't. He's maniacal and full of expression, shrieking and laughing like a madman in contrast to Ichigo's dour and stoic vibe. When the two activate Bankai and when they clash swords, I love White's huge, toothy grin, his jester-like smile, and just how much he doesn't really resemble Ichigo at all at points, working then as the perfect juxtaposition. That's a testament to Kubo's artwork. These characters are the same, they look the same, and yet feel wholly different. And by the way, White's appearance in Deicide is extremely cool, taking on a refined version of Ichigo's monstrous instinctual form that tore Ulquiorra apart. He exudes power. And of course, that's the point. The version we see of White here is, fascinatingly, never meant to be. Ichigo is too afraid of his hollowification to achieve this state, as we recently discovered thanks to Club Outside. Ichigo's final hollow mask design is only a half step. Really, he should have been conjuring this version of the mask that White is now wearing, but he can't make it a reality. So, essentially, Ichigo ends up leapfrogging this stage of his power, and instead going straight to merging his states together. It's a shame White doesn't get to do anything when he looks like this, instead fusing with Tensa Zangetsu almost immediately. It is kind of crazy to think that White battling Ichigo during his Vizard training and this version of White both appear in the same arc, albeit at different ends of the spectrum. They kind of feel like totally different stories at that point. Up next is Tensa Zangetsu, whose visual design is probably the least interesting of the incarnations of Zangetsu, though again I still like it. Considerably younger than the old man, Tensa has much softer features and yet strangely piercing eyes, which I think gives him an effective appearance. There's no doubt, though, that he resembles other characters within the world of Bleach more so than, say, Old Man Zangetsu, whom the only character he resembles is one that is supposed to look like him by design. The same goes for White as well. For me, at least, Ulquiorra was always the one character who came to mind the most when Tensa was revealed first, but I think he does enough to stand alone at the same time. His outfit is cool too, jet black, without a hint of the white found on the old man's, save for within the hood, and yet the hood gives him a childish edge, which I think really works, especially considering he was supposed to be the younger variant. And it's cool as well how Kubo takes this design, and really without doing much at all, without really any alteration, manages to make it appear sinister when it's revealed to be in truth a teenage version of Yhwach Arc himself. And last but again not least, we have White Tensa, designed to be an amalgamation of all of Ichigo's power. I've talked in the past about how interesting and revealing an entity White Tensa actually is when you sit back and think about it. After all, Deicide really was The Blade Is Me, but about 150 chapters early. White Tensa is the proof of Ichigo's heritage, of his status as a perfect hybrid, all rolled into one. We just didn't know it at the time, and neither did he. Now, White Tensa's design leaves a little to be desired in some aspects, I think. By design, it is not as slick, nor as sleek as Tensa's or White's beforehand, and it does look a little messy, a little overdone, but again, that is clearly the point. This is literally everything Ichigo is as a single person. I do wonder what aspect of this look actually reflects Ichigo's Shinigami powers. Would it be the gown, perhaps, or is it just supposed to be the sword? Either way, I like how this form blends even the personalities of Zangetsu too, with White Tensa now being much more unpredictable and explosive than Tensa was, incorporating elements of White before him as well. Honestly, these names are getting a little confusing, so let's move on to Zangetsu's role in Bleach. Zangetsu plays a fairly small, but of course consequential role in Bleach. As the embodiment of Ichigo's powers, Zangetsu is mostly tied intimately to our main character, appearing at pivotal moments of Ichigo's growth. And yet, Zangetsu does affect the outside world every now and then too, his influence felt in ripples across the story of Bleach. Often these moments are shocking, unexpected, and the most memorable in the story, with Zangetsu tipping the scales in some of Bleach's biggest battles, coming in clutch to rescue Ichigo from the jaws of defeat, or stepping in when our hero has already failed. Zangetsu is a totally unique character whose arc of protection, dedication, and yes, deceit spans the entire story, with Ichigo's inner world making an appearance in almost every single major arc of Bleach. There is a soft tragedy to Zangetsu, and yet Kubo manages to develop even this ethereal being into someone with goals, motivations, and drive, culminating in an effective climax that completely transformed our perception of the character. Even if I do think Zangetsu's time in the story came to an end a little too soon, but we'll get to that. That being said, ultimately Zangetsu ends up being one of the most impressive elements of Bleach to me. Kubo took what felt like a system of characters and revelations that was spiraling out of control and managed to sew it back together again in a way that worked convincingly and was in fact quite smart in the Thousand-Year Blood War arc. So let's take a look at what role Zangetsu and his multiple forms played throughout Bleach and the journey they have taken alongside Ichigo. Zangetsu's story begins with Chapter 63. With Ichigo trapped in the Shattered Shaft, he is given two choices by Kisuke. Either he successfully becomes a Shinigami and escapes, or he transforms into a Hollow. After his chain of fate is completely eroded away, Ichigo begins to hollowfy, a thick white mask exploding into life, forming across his face. On the outside, Ichigo is screaming in agony and fear, and yet within the confines of his soul, things are decidedly more peaceful for now. Ichigo's eyes crack slowly open to the sound of an unusual, unfamiliar voice. Someone is asking if he can hear him. Whoever this person is, they seem to know Ichigo. And Ichigo glances over at a shadowy man standing atop a flagpole, his cloak of darkness rippling in the wind. Ichigo asks the man who he is, and the man replies, but his voice is distorted by darkness. Now, in recent years, Kubo has claimed that this darkness we see in the source material is caused by Ichibei's power. But I'll admit I've never truly bought that, I've got to be totally honest. That seems like a classic example of Kubo taking a reader's presumptive question and running with it, something we have seen many times before in our Club Outside Q&A roundups. First of all, how would that even work? Are we saying Ichibei has somehow put a preemptive stopper on Ichigo's inner power some 20-odd years prior to him being born? Because that would imply many things, not least of all that the Soul Society knew about Isshin's eloping with Masaki, or at least the Zero Division did. And far be it from me to question Ichibei's power of all characters in the series, it is absolutely possible. Ichibei does seem to know all and see all to some degree, but I just don't buy it. If Ichibei was capable of doing that, of shutting out Arc Arc's name, or in this case Zangetsu's name, again, they're not even using the same name in this instance, why wouldn't he shut down the presence and power of Arc Arc in every Sternritter too? There's absolutely nothing to say that Ichibei's godlike divine power is limited to only Shinigami, so why wouldn't he just blot out Arc Arc in every single Sternritter? Again, an argument could be made that where the Sternritter are concerned, the power of names isn't quite as integral as it is to a Shinigami or a prospective Shinigami, I suppose. But again, you have to ask the question, how did Ichibei even know to do this when he doesn't even seem to really know who Ichigo is until they finally meet face to face? Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but to me, this moment is simply Ichigo unable to hear his Zanpakuto's name, something we also see when Hitsugaya witnesses Hyorin Maru for the first time. But wait, Old Man Zangetsu isn't his Zanpakuto, so how would that work? Well, Old Man Zangetsu is still one with White, and in fact is suppressing and subjugating him at this very moment. White is a part of him, they share the same form. Later we see White return to being one with the old man, so it makes perfect sense to me that Ichigo wouldn't be able to hear him. At the end of the day, Ichigo gets a Zanpakuto from this encounter, just not a true one, the likes of which an actual Shinigami has. Ichigo's weird, abortive Zanpakuto is only possible thanks to his strange, uniquely hybrid state, but it's a Zanpakuto all the same. But with Ichigo struggling to decipher who this enigmatic figure really is, Zangetsu suddenly turns the tables on him, Ichigo's inner world flipping. Where once Ichigo found himself sitting upon a horizontal skyscraper, now he's falling backwards towards the ground. There's some excellent imagery on display here as the world begins to collapse around them both, Ichigo's soul breaking down as he holophies. Zangetsu proceeds to gather Reishi in his hand, which is admittedly a very Quincy-like image, before revealing to Ichigo that the Shinigami powers he lost in his duel with Byakuya were merely those given to him by Rukia. He has his own latent powers lying dormant in his soul, which he now needs to awaken. As the skyscraper crumbles behind Zangetsu, raining pure white boxes down upon the ground, Ichigo falls through the very earth beneath him, disappearing into a watery abyss. Of course, this imagery is very similar to what we see in Ichigo's final meeting with the old man too, when he's plunged into the depths upon the revelation of Zangetsu's true identity. I've always found this to work very well. I like how here we see Ichigo fall into the abyss due to his struggle and confusion, and later it is due to his horror and immense sadness. Meanwhile, during Deicide, his inner world is already submerged due to his stunted growth and terror of his own power. But as Ichigo unlocks his power, clutching at the red spirit ribbon to reveal a Zanpakuto's hilt, Zangetsu smiles warmly, hopeful that his name will reach Ichigo next time. As Ichigo slowly realizes just who he's talking to, he pulls his sword free of the box and transforms into a Shinigami, escaping the shattered shaft just in time. Later, as Kisuke battles Ichigo during his training, Ichigo finds his empty shell of a sword is no match for Kisuke's own Benihime. Ichigo turns tail and runs, only to find himself cornered by Zangetsu, who appears before him. This is an interesting moment. Ichigo is somehow in his inner world, even though he's kind of in the midst of a fight with Kisuke where he is actively participating. It's not like Zangetsu's next appearance where Ichigo is on the verge of passing out against Kenpachi. Here, Ichigo kind of just screeches to a stop to address his Zanpakuto spirit in the moment. But Zangetsu wonders why Ichigo runs from battle when he hasn't even called his name yet. As Zangetsu instructs Ichigo standing by his side, we get one of his most famous quotes ever. "Abandon your fear. Face forward. Advance. Don't give an inch. Retreat and you will age. Be afraid and you will die. Shout my name." And with that, Ichigo twists on the spot, his Zanpakuto exploding with a vibrant light as he calls the name Zangetsu. Now, before we continue on to the Soul Society arc, first a word from today's sponsor. As a huge fan of Bleach and anime in general, I've always wanted to visit Japan, but not knowing much Japanese can make the trip feel a little daunting. Of course, I've tried to learn with a teacher in the past, but one-to-one tutoring can be expensive, especially when you're attending classes for potentially months on end. And that's where Rosetta Stone comes in. If you've tried to learn a language before, you'll remember having to memorize vocabulary over and over, but that isn't the case here. Rosetta Stone's method is essentially based on immersion, which means there's no translation. You'll start speaking in your new language from day one. You're also able to get yourself conversation ready while tailoring your learning to your schedule. The app displays your upcoming lessons and units as a bespoke plan, dedicated to you and what you want to achieve with your language learning. They even have a voice recognition tool to improve your accent.
家族
Also, their stories feature blends real-life conversation with your learning by allowing you to listen to a native speaker. It's a more natural method of learning a language akin to picking it up by listening to locals. So if you're thinking about learning a language, try Rosetta Stone. The lifetime 25 languages offer is currently 50% off when you visit the link in my description, giving you lifetime access to all 25 languages available on the app. Or there's also the lifetime one language offer instead. For me, it was Japanese. For you, it might be something completely different. Either way, make sure to further explore the world of Rosetta Stone, a world that's constantly evolving. Okay, and back to the story of Zangetsu. Much later come the Soul Society arc, Ichigo battles Kenpachi Zaraki, as we just mentioned, surprised to learn that the Captain's Zanpakuto seemingly has no name. When Ichigo foolishly thinks Kenpachi's blade can become no stronger as a result, Zangetsu falters, weakening under Ichigo's mistake, and Kenpachi skewers him through the chest, seemingly ending the fight. As Kenpachi turns to leave, Ichigo struggles to stay alive, desperate to save Rukia, when suddenly one of the most iconic shots in Bleach is born. Who should appear beside Kenpachi than old man Zangetsu himself walking the streets of the Seirete? Except Kenpachi can't see him, of course. Time seems to slow down as Zangetsu approaches Ichigo, the man garbed in black, towering over even Zaraki himself, something that is nicely reflected in Yhwach's massive frame later in the series. A visibly disappointed Zangetsu demands to know whether Ichigo simply wants to live or if he wants to win. When Ichigo roars that he wants to win, Zangetsu envelops him in a shadowy darkness, taking him within his soul. This would later be revealed to be the Quincy's shadow technique, which again, I'm not sure I fully buy. How does the Quincy's shadow take Ichigo into his own inner world? The shadow technique only works because it stems from the Schattenbereich, the realm where the Vandenreich reside. Those are the very shadows they move around in. It's not just a teleportation ability. The shadows have to be connected in some way to the Vandenreich to actually be able to be used like that. But regardless, this is one of the most consequential meetings Ichigo has within his inner world. The first appearance of White himself. The old man tosses Ichigo in a Sauchi with disdain, telling him it's a nameless blade for those unworthy of the Gotei 13, while keeping the true Zangetsu for himself. Telling Ichigo he can't give him this blade, the old man launches it from the rooftop, causing Ichigo to leap after it, except he doesn't reach it. A strange figure in white shoves him aside, snatching up the sword and taking it for himself. As Ichigo wonders who this newcomer is, White turns to face him, revealing himself to be a sinister doppelganger of Ichigo himself. The old man is unsure as to whether or not Ichigo is truly worthy of wielding him, and so this will be Ichigo's test. It's hard to know why White goes along with the deception here. Is it simply because he's currently being suppressed by Ichigo's Quincy powers, and therefore has to do what the old man wants of him? I would assume so. That seems to make the most sense to me. Either way, what starts out as a fairly typical fantasy trope would evolve into something truly meaningful over the course of the story itself. White battles Ichigo furiously, pushing back on his blank sword with an incredible power. As White's Reiatsu erupts, it vaguely takes the form of the eyes of Ichigo's hollow mask, or what would be Ichigo's hollow mask in the future, enveloping the battlefield in a red and white hue. In the presence of this overwhelming power, Ichigo realizes that he has never really understood Zangetsu's true strength, and he watches in shock as White wields the blade in new and unorthodox ways, such as slinging it towards Ichigo by its bandaged hilt. This image of White spinning Zangetsu by the wrappings, red fire behind him, is an amazing shot, and it is a huge shame that despite Ichigo supposedly realizing and acknowledging just how powerful Zangetsu could be were he to use it properly or at least imaginatively, he never really does. We never see this out of Ichigo himself. But it makes total sense, of course, in the moment that White is a master of Zangetsu. After all, it literally is him. This next monologue of White's is definitely a little strange in retrospect, as he talks about Zangetsu as though he were someone else, a real anger on his face as he barks at Ichigo for merely calling his sword's name and thinking that's all it takes. White tells Ichigo that Zangetsu is a mighty sword, yet he's barely using it. As White overwhelms Ichigo, the boy realizes his crucial mistake. He was glad to hear that Zaraki's sword apparently didn't have a name, but of course it does, and Ichigo shouldn't have been so gleeful to learn about its mistreatment. Zanpakuto are alive. They have souls of their own, and Ichigo demonstrated his own failing and lack of understanding here at a critical juncture. All he's done so far is learn Zangetsu's name and then basically never spoken to him again. But again, it's a little sad to see this in retrospect. Ichigo is supposed to learn something here, and yet not once does he visit Zangetsu of his own volition until the Deicide arc, and even then it's only because he needs something from him. There's definitely the sense that Ichigo doesn't value Zangetsu as anything more than a tool, even if we are meant to believe otherwise, and that is a shame. If there's one thing I'd have liked, it would be more scenes with these characters in particular to really flesh this relationship out, because I think Ichigo himself needed it more so than even Zangetsu. But with White lunging for Ichigo, Ichigo stops to think for a moment, telling Zangetsu that while he was a fool, he wants to learn more about him and he wants to engage with him, acknowledging him as more than an empty weapon or a tool to be used. This is a huge step in Ichigo and Zangetsu's journey. Now, Ichigo considers them partners. Zangetsu gives him another chance, and White suddenly finds Zangetsu back in Ichigo's hands, the Asauchi split in two. With Ichigo now returned to the Soul Society to continue his fight with Kenpachi, we get a rare scene that I imagine Kubo somewhat regretted when it came to the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. The old man thanks White for helping with Ichigo's training, apologizing for troubling him, but White says that since Ichigo is the king of their world, he'll help in any way he can. Proceeding to call the old man Zangetsu even when it's just the two of them around, White then leaves him with an ominous farewell as he disappears back into the shadowy figure, telling Zangetsu to train Ichigo thoroughly, for one day his power will be his. Looking back on it, it is definitely possible that White meant that eventually Ichigo's power will literally be his own, but it's clear that during the development of these characters, Kubo initially envisioned White as a sinister being who wanted to overthrow Ichigo legitimately. Sure, he is depicted here as being a part of the old man, but he's clearly supposed to be an evil antagonistic force. As White vanishes, the old man tells Ichigo that he hates the rain. It rains even here in Ichigo's inner world, and the rain pours whenever he's sad and upset. The old man ponders that even Ichigo wouldn't know what it's like to be rained on in such a lonely world, and how terrifying that is, and says that he will give Ichigo everything he has in order to hold back the rainfall. We get a truly awesome shot of Zangetsu as he gazes up into the sky, the clouds swirling around his very being as he implores Ichigo to understand that he isn't fighting alone. In the same way, Zangetsu feels terror at being forced to endure the rain all alone. Ichigo felt that he had been fighting on his own, taking on the full force of the Gotei 13 without someone at his back, struggling to take a step forward in a huge world, and now they can fight side by side at last in understanding. As Kenpachi reveals his trump card, removing his eye patch and unleashing his full power, Zangetsu appears once more behind Ichigo, placing his hand upon his shoulder. Zangetsu asks if Ichigo can hear the screams of Kenpachi's sword, and we get an awesome visual of Kenpachi's blade crumbling away as the old man reveals that his strength is diminished as a result of being unable to hear what his Zanpakuto has to say. As Zangetsu also takes hold of the hilt of Ichigo's sword, their power increases yet again, Ichigo's body consumed by billowing yellow flames which take on the appearance of his hollow mask, which is very interesting. It's possible Kubo just wanted an aesthetic in the moment that mirrored the daunting skull that appeared behind Kenpachi, but there's no denying that Ichigo is wielding the power of his hollow here too, as their battle comes to an end. It's later revealed that Ichigo has been unknowingly protected throughout several of his battles so far by a mysterious hollow mask that keeps on reappearing. And of course, this is something that will continue to happen throughout not just this arc, but the entire first half of the story, ever escalating over time. But for now, Ichigo needs to learn Bankai. And so, using Kisuke's invention of a Tenshintai, Yoruichi materializes the old man into the world with them both. In order to learn Bankai, the Zanpakuto spirit must be materialized into the world around them and then forced to submit to the Shinigami in battle. There's a nice little detail to be found here. The Tenshintai itself has a rope attached to its chest, and now that he's been summoned through this method, Zangetsu too bears that same rope, showing that really Ichigo is fighting the Tenshintai itself. That doll is acting as a conduit for Zangetsu's physical form. I feel like it definitely goes overlooked somewhat just how broken the Tenshintai actually is when you think about it. It completely skips so much training by forcibly materializing a Zanpakuto spirit in an instant. It's kind of crazy. Again, how the Tenshintai can summon something that doesn't have any Shinigami power at all is questionable, but I think we are again supposed to believe that White is technically still in there as a part of the shadowy old man all this time. But the gauntlet is thrown. Old man Zangetsu is allowed to choose the method of training, and so he conjures thousands of distinct Zanpakuto, declaring that Ichigo must find the real one in order to cut him down. Each of the blades represents a part of Ichigo's spirit, and when Ichigo thinks he's found the real one each time, Zangetsu obliterates it, carving a wound into the boy. One thing I've always liked about this is that since he's outside Ichigo's inner world now, Zangetsu is privy to everything going on. He knows what's happening, he knows why Ichigo is fighting and why he's so determined. He's, for all intents and purposes, actually a character in the wider story for once. And yet he forces Ichigo to learn Bankai properly, or as properly as can be in these circumstances, all the same. For example, when Renji reveals to them all that Rukia's execution has been brought forward to tomorrow, Zangetsu is shocked just like everyone else. But that doesn't mean he's just going to up and give Ichigo Bankai. He still needs to earn it all the same, and I really respect that. There's an awesome sense of progression to be found here, and one of the things I love the most about this arc is that everyone has something to do at all times that presses the narrative forwards. Ichigo's training here feels desperate, but fair and satisfying to see him work through. As Zangetsu suddenly surrounds Ichigo with numerous apparitions of himself, he warns him that he won't hold back, just because time is short. Ichigo's Bankai training actually takes a very long time, lasting approximately 20 chapters or so, but finally he completes it and masters Bankai, learning Tensa Zangetsu at last. However, we're not quite finished with Zangetsu in this arc just yet. Just as Ichigo is about to be killed by Byakuya in their ultimate duel, he catches Byakuya's blade in his bare hand as a mysterious, cackling presence takes over Ichigo's body. The culmination of the protection of his hollow mask has revealed itself at last. While back in the day we thought this was Hollow Ichigo taking control of Ichigo's body in a murderous, animalistic rampage, in reality, we now know better. It is Zangetsu himself, which explains exactly why he is so skilled at using Ichigo's Bankai. Zangetsu berates Ichigo for being useless as he dances circles around Byakuya, even unleashing a black Getsuga Tensho at him, something we had never seen before until this moment. Zangetsu reveals that he can feel Ichigo's body creaking and buckling under the pressure of merely using Bankai, but that he can use it freely, which is how he's suddenly moving so rapidly once again. Zangetsu repeatedly tells Byakuya that he doesn't have a name, presumably because it's not for Byakuya to hear from Ichigo's own Zanpakuto spirit, before preparing to end the fight and kill the captain. Ichigo, however, manages to regain control, ripping his hollow mask fragment from his face and freeing himself of Zangetsu's mad influence in time to end the fight his own way. As we move into the Arrancar arc, White begins to take prominence in Ichigo's story. The old man is nowhere to be seen in this arc, which is crazy when you consider how long it is as well. Instead, White is emerging as the dominant power at last after his emergence in the battle with Byakuya, now threatening to subjugate and crush Ichigo if he continues being too weak, worried he'll get them all killed. And we see this in action a couple of times. Zangetsu threatens to take over Ichigo's body as the boy battles Yami, but Ichigo is afraid of letting that power loose again, leading to him being sabotaged by Zangetsu and their internal tug-of-war as Yami beats him to a pulp. The same occurrence happens again as Ichigo fights Grimmjow, with him doing everything he can to force Zangetsu back down once more. This is of course an unnatural, unsustainable partnership, but it's what Ichigo thinks he currently has to do. And so as the pressure builds, as Ichigo begins to truly fear this being existing within him, not yet knowing what White really is or represents, terrified of being devoured by him, Ichigo seeks out the Vizard for help, exiled Shinigami who have all bested their own inner hollows. And while what they have and what Ichigo has are not the same, it's close enough for now. As their training begins, Ichigo finds himself back inside his inner world, only this time he's confronted by White and White alone. As the two of them clash, Ichigo demands to know where Zangetsu is. But White professes that he is Zangetsu, drawing a white blade and using it to lock swords with Ichigo. White tells Ichigo that the two of them have always been one, as evidenced by White disappearing into the old man's form. However, as Ichigo continued to draw on Zangetsu's strength, White became more powerful, more dominant, and forced the old man to become a part of him instead. Of course, it is very telling. White wears a Shinigami Shahakusho, but its colours are inverted, and he has the appearance of a hollow to a degree, signifying the perfect fusion. As Ichigo tries to use Bankai, so too does White, shocking him. But of course, White knows how to use Bankai, telling Ichigo he learned it at the same time he did, as it's his power to begin with. The two of them do battle in a spectacular showdown, the skyscrapers shattering and exploding beneath their feet. White wonders why Ichigo is so angry, and it's easy to see that line in a new light. Ichigo is still unaware of who White really is, despite him flat out telling him. As White continues to showcase how talented he is with Ichigo's powers, carving through a Getsuga Tensho with his bare hand before unleashing one back at Ichigo with the power of a colossal bomb blast, swallowing the boy whole in the white light, he takes hold of Ichigo's Bankai and disintegrates it, telling Ichigo that he is merely trying to imitate him after White was the first to use Getsuga Tensho in Bankai during their battle with Byakuya. As White overpowers Ichigo, he unleashes his most famous speech, and one of the greatest, most iconic monologues in all of Bleach. Throwing Ichigo into a building, White casually asks him what the difference is between a king and his horse. When two beings are the same, what is it that allows one to dominate the other? To lead them into battle while the other lends them their strength. It's a killer instinct, something Ichigo seemingly lacks. White, or as we should call him, Zangetsu, tells Ichigo that he doesn't have that drive, that bloodlust, that ambition, that primordial instinctive desire to fight and to kill, and that's what holds him back. White asks Ichigo how he can possibly slay with a sheathed sword, before driving that very sword through Ichigo's gut, impaling him on the end of his white tensor Zangetsu. Zangetsu says that he refuses to die alongside a fool who can't keep them alive. Instead, he'll simply crush Ichigo himself and take over his body once and for all in order to destroy their enemies. And sure, as we will see later, that might be a good thing for Ichigo in the short term. Certainly the majority of his enemies wouldn't be able to stand against him. But at what cost? Ichigo himself will almost certainly be lost in a sea of swords, blood, and death, an unfettered Zangetsu let loose on the world to ravage and destroy it without mercy. And I have to wonder here, is Zangetsu the only Zanpakuto spirit capable of doing something like this, of completely taking over their Shinigami's body and running rampage? And if so, I presume it's because of the hollow influence within him. But instead, Ichigo fights back, finding that drive and that instinct, taking hold of the Zanpakuto and stripping its power from White's hand. Finding his resolve, Ichigo plunges Zangetsu through White's chest, enveloping the spirit in darkness and completing his training. As White is draped in Ichigo's black Shihakusho, he submits to him, acknowledging him as the king for now. However, as White disappears upon the wind, he warns Ichigo that he could overthrow him at any point. And if Ichigo really wants to control his powers, then until the next time they meet, he needs to make sure he doesn't get killed. As White leaves Ichigo with this ominous message, he vanishes entirely in a violent explosion of light that ripples outwards, fracturing and shattering Ichigo's monstrous form in the real world along with it. I do love the visual of White's body disappearing, the way we can see his skeleton beneath his flesh as it falls apart like meat from the bone. It's as though he's decaying before our very eyes. Interestingly, we don't see or hear from Ichigo's inner world again now for a very long time. In fact, we don't return to this plotline until White's ominous prophecy does indeed come true. Much later, during the final battles of the war in Hueco Mundo, Ichigo is brutally killed by Ulquiorra, who blasts a cavernous hole through his chest. In that moment, Zangetsu returns, completely taking over Ichigo's body with a hollow-like appearance. Ichigo's hair grows extremely long and he gains a horned hollow mask, everything coalescing around the enormous hollow hole now prominently found in his chest. And yet, the fact that it is more than a mere hollow transformation is swiftly evident. Zangetsu is able to call Ichigo's Bankai to him with his bare hand, and he demonstrates an unbelievable power. This is what happens when White is able to be the king without limit. He unleashes a massive Sero that overpowers Ulquiorra's own before ripping off the Espada's arm, shrieking a twisted, inhuman wail. Although Ulquiorra attempts to fight back, in truth, there is little he can do. He doesn't stand a chance against this hellish horned demon, this ghoul who utilizes a mixture of Shinigami and Hollow abilities and fighting styles to completely overwhelm him, culminating in Zangetsu grabbing the Espada's lance in his bare hand, shattering it with his claws, before delivering the fatal slash. Here, despite there being very little of Ichigo left to identify him, this mysterious form demonstrates a mastery over both Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers, detonating another Sero in an attempt to wipe out Ulquiorra for good. When Uryu later attempts to intervene, trying to reason with whatever humanity is left within Ichigo, Zangetsu stabs him through the gut before moving to end his life as well, determined to wipe out everyone that stands in the way of Ichigo's current mission, protecting Orihime. But Ulquiorra rescues Uryu at the last second, severing Zangetsu's horn and his control over Ichigo's body. As the horned hollow mask shatters, revealing a fully hollowified Ichigo beneath, whose eyes resemble White's, White saves Ichigo one last time by restoring the hole in his chest with high-speed regeneration. However, this incident leaves Ichigo innately terrified of his hollow powers and unable to properly hollowify moving forward. In the end, White's parting words from his training with the Vizards came to pass, and they were terrifying to behold. Much later, as the Arrancar Arc hurtles to its end, Ichigo teams up with his father Isshin to learn the final Getsuga Tensho in order to stop Aizen from achieving his goal. For the first time ever, Ichigo enters his inner world of his own volition, utilizing the meditative stance of Jinzen to do so. Once in his inner world, Ichigo finds it completely transformed, a shell of what it once was. The skyscrapers that once represented his hope and ambition are gone, replaced entirely with the diminutive Karakura town instead, and the entire place is now submerged beneath the ocean's surface. Ichigo's growth has stunted. His mind and focus are entirely fixed upon Karakura town, while the fear of his inner hollow has resurfaced once more after the battle with Ulquiorra, forcing Ichigo beneath the water. As he arrives in his inner world, Ichigo is intercepted by a strange hooded figure, who reveals Tensa Zangetsu by his side. Ichigo wonders once again where the old man is, but the mysterious figure casts off his hood, revealing a youthful face and head of shaggy black hair. The spirit reveals himself to be none other than Tensa Zangetsu, and he locks blades with Ichigo. Ichigo demands to know the secret behind the final Getsuga Tensho, but Tensa notes that what Ichigo wants to protect isn't what he wants to protect. As Ichigo searches for answers, Tensa is angry with him, blaming him for the current state of their pitiful world. The old man once implored Ichigo to keep the rain away, and that he would help him to do so, but now their world has sunk to the bottom of the abyss, drowning everything they once had. Tensa, determined to free Ichigo from what is holding him back, rams his hand into Ichigo's chest and forcibly rips White from him, blood splattering everywhere. I like the implications of this. White, as Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirit, should have been here in the inner world with Tensa when Ichigo arrived, but instead he was actually physically within Ichigo. Not literally, of course, on the outside world, it's a metaphor, but here in the inner world, that's where he's to be found this time, because his presence is lingering on Ichigo's heart to such a heavy degree. He's like a parasite, a virus that's been living and growing once again inside Ichigo's body. And as mentioned earlier in this video, White now displays a slightly different look. His hair is much longer, and he now wears the same horned mask that Ichigo did in his duel with Ulquiorra. This is the picture of what Ichigo should have become after that fight, but his fear has held him back. Bear in mind that at this point it had been almost 200 chapters since we last saw White. For those of us reading weekly, that was probably close to 5 years when you account for any breaks. And as he removed his mask, asking if Ichigo recognized him or not, it was an awesome, cathartic moment. Ichigo is aghast to see his nemesis has returned, but Zangetsu tells him that he did warn him about dying before they met again. Now that White is accounted for, Tensa Zangetsu tells Ichigo that they are one, just as White once told him the same thing before. And before Ichigo's very eyes, the two entities break down and begin to fuse, their bodies combining, becoming White Tensa, the picture of Ichigo's true strength. Finally, they do battle, White Tensa rushing into the fray against Ichigo as the clock ticks down to doom outside in Karakura Town. There's a sense that Kubo was attempting to recreate the sensation of Ichigo's training for Bankai here, a sense of desperation to their battle as something terrible looms on the horizon. Before it was Rukia's execution, this time it is the destruction of Karakura Town itself. Eventually, as Ichigo doesn't back down, his hair now long from the length of time they've been training, White Tensa lunges for him, roaring that he will never teach him the final Getsuga Tensho, but Ichigo tosses his sword aside. He allows it to float away on the water, accepting Zangetsu's blade as a part of himself, and allowing the spirit to run him through. Realizing in that moment that Ichigo has succeeded, White Tensa begins to cry, as the mysterious power of the final Getsuga Tensho flows from him. When Ichigo wonders why he's crying, Tensa, as the waters part around them, reveals that the thing he wanted to protect all along was none other than Ichigo himself. It was a fairly obvious revelation, I think, but extremely impactful all the same. As Ichigo activates the final Getsuga Tensho against Aizen, White Tensa explains to him that he will lose all of his Shinigami powers upon the activation of this technique before bidding Ichigo farewell. A sorrowful yet proud smile on his face as Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirit and the amalgamation of his powers disappears forever. Now, of course, you and I know that he isn't gone for good, but Zangetsu doesn't reappear for quite some time. But as you might recall, earlier I mentioned that I felt more than anything the characters of Zangetsu needed more scenes. And it really feels like there are certain portions of the story that are begging for an appearance from them, that are crying out for a trip to Ichigo's inner world once again. And still, he never seems to visit of his own accord, at least not that we see. And we certainly should have seen it even just once, where he visits when he doesn't want anything from Zangetsu, instead he's just there to see them. The perfect time for that would have been when he got his Shinigami powers back in the Lost Agent arc. And to be honest, it is weird that we don't see them at all, though I appreciate time and space are both limited quantities in that arc. It's a huge deal though when Zangetsu fades away after Ichigo activates the final Getsuga Tensho, and yet we don't get to see their reunion at all. The Lost Agent arc should have ended with Ichigo now wearing his Fullbring Shihakusho, setting up to use Jinzen before opening his eyes in his inner world to see the old man and White once again. Plus, as an added bonus, we would have then been able to see White dressed in Ichigo's Fullbring Shikai. Considering that is Ichigo's coolest Shikai, at least in my opinion, it is a shame we never saw White in that outfit, or his Fullbring Bankai either, to be exact. Instead, we have to wait until chapter 540, 60 chapters deep into the 1000-Year Blood War arc, for the reappearance of the old man. The first time we have seen him since the Soul Society arc, which is mind-blowing when you consider how important he is to Ichigo as a character. After his Bankai is broken, Ichigo travels to the royal palace, to the very forge of the Zanpakuto itself, where he finally returns to his inner world once more. Only this time, things feel quite different. Here, Nimaya Oetsu reveals to Ichigo the terrible truth. The old man isn't the source of his Shinigami power at all. Instead, he is a vision of the monstrous Quincy King Yhwach from 1,000 years ago, and is the source of Ichigo's latent Quincy powers inherited from his mother. Instead, White is actually Zangetsu himself, the source of both Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers, which have been fused together since day one, as evidenced by Ichigo escaping the shattered shaft with both a Zanpakuto and a Hollow Mask. This felt like a massive betrayal. The skyscrapers of Ichigo's world shatter and implode beneath him as he struggles to comprehend the truth of what he's learning. What starts out as rain only escalates as the old man speaks, climaxing when both he and the old man are plunged back into the abyssal depths of the sea once more to face the truth together. The old man reveals that he has never lied to Ichigo save for the truth of his own name. Everything else, though, has been very real. And the old man goes on to explain to Ichigo that whenever he tried to teach him the truth of his Zanpakuto, there was always a Hollow there by his side. And during his most dangerous fights, his most desperate hours, whenever Ichigo came close to dying or did die, it was his Hollow that rescued him, not the old man. And there's no doubting these facts. So here's what I think happened from a writing perspective, because ultimately it doesn't all quite add up, though it's very nearly there. I think Kubo always planned for White to be Zangetsu, and to be an embodiment of Ichigo's powers in the truest sense of the word. I just think Old Man Zangetsu was originally supposed to be basically the same thing, was supposed to be his other half essentially, not anything to do with Quincy powers. Because Quincy powers are essentially totally separate, where Ichigo's Shinigami and Hollow powers have been fused together from the very beginning. I've said it before, but I do think this was an incredibly bold move on Kubo's part, and I imagine it was the twist he was perhaps the most apprehensive of. It completely upends one of the core relationships at the very centre of the story, at the nexus of our main character's journey, and it was a big risk. Like I said at the start of the video, however, I'm impressed with how it all came together in the end, with Zangetsu's journey coming to a close here in a very satisfying and emotional way. The old man opens his cloak for the first time ever, revealing his white undershirt, but more importantly revealing Ichigo's true power that he's been keeping hidden all this time in the form of a flaming blue sword. As Zangetsu begins to cry, he reveals that he's at last stepping aside. He'll no longer suppress Ichigo's power, nor will he prevent his quest to become a Shinigami. After all, Ichigo is a Shinigami at heart. It is what he's meant to be. And as Zangetsu's body turns to dust before Ichigo's eyes, all he's left with is the enormous blazing sword behind him, and Zangetsu's words echoing in his mind. I remember hoping that his true Shikai would actually be a huge cross-guard broadsword as depicted here, but alas it wasn't to be. I like that Zangetsu himself is still visible within the flames, however, reminding us that he will always be a part of Ichigo, even if he has diminished himself. As Ichigo reaches to take hold of his true power, his inner world is consumed by a brilliant, blinding light, and then there's silence. As he's left to ponder, Ichigo realizes that there were no lies. Not in the old man's words, nor White's. And so, in perhaps his most mature moment in the series, Ichigo readily accepts both the old man and White as Zangetsu, as the combined sources of his power, all of which he's happy to call Zangetsu. As a result, he's able to soar upwards and out of the water, all the while making sure that's all right with Zangetsu himself, freeing the old man of the burden of guilt he must have felt, and considering the feelings of those within his soul. And so, as Ichigo emerges, he grabs hold of his newly forged Zanpakuto, placing his hands within the very flame of the furnace itself. With Oetsu's guidance, Ichigo triumphantly rips his blades from the fire, swinging them about his head with such force and heat that they evaporate the entirety of the ocean surrounding Oetsu's forge. As everyone looks on in awe, Ichigo stands tall with his true Zanpakuto at long last. In one hand, he wields a long black blade, the embodiment of the fusion of his Shinigami and Hollow powers, while in the other, he holds a much smaller, much shorter sword, the reflection of his Quincy powers. And here in Ichigo's hands is the very same power that he battled in Deicide, White Tensor. All his spirits, all his elements come together, fused into a single entity. Here, he has achieved balance. More importantly, however, two figures watch over him. Old Man Zangetsu and White, balanced and in harmony at last. And so, throughout this lengthy video, we've seen not only Zangetsu's story, but Ichigo's journey as well, as he went from learning Zangetsu's name to not understanding the Zanpakuto or its strength, to considering it not just a tool, but a partner. As his own power grew, Ichigo then feared his weapon as it grew unruly, before eventually learning to let it go completely, making the ultimate sacrifice. And now, here, he is renewed, he is restored, and he's finally learned the ultimate lesson. Zangetsu isn't a tool, nor a partner, nor a friend, nor a mentor. Zangetsu, all forms of it, is Ichigo himself. As his blades vanish, Ichigo notes that he won't ask for Zangetsu's help anymore, nor will he tell him to stay out of his way. He won't even ask them to fight with him. Instead, he'll fight alone, because they are him anyway. It's of course an excellent perennial moment in the story that feels like it brings Ichigo's development totally full circle. He's never been more mature, more in control. And at the same time, Zangetsu has never seemed more mindful, or watchful, or proud. Again, I think it was a missed opportunity to not have White say anything in this arc at all. It doesn't have to be here during this scene, as this is Old Man Zangetsu's moment, but for Ichigo to not visit them at all during the 1,000-Year Blood War arc is again really odd. White has just been revealed to not be this evil doppelganger, the shadowy side of Ichigo, but instead to be his actual Zanpakuto, and yet he doesn't speak to him at all. There's no reconciliation outside of the prideful look on White's face now that he knows Ichigo is finally there, he's finally over the line. And so that is a shame, and yet if the series does find a way to continue, I'm sure they will come together once more. White, or should I say Zangetsu, may feel quite different too if they do. But that's it for this mammoth character analysis, as we took a deep dive into Ichigo's inner world, spending time with some of Bleach's most consequential and yet barely visible characters. Without Zangetsu, there wouldn't be an Ichigo, and that's true many times over. Ultimately, the truth of Zangetsu remains one of the series' biggest twists, but I think Kubo, against all odds, managed to make it work. It helps that for me, on a personal level, I love the idea of White being the true source of Ichigo's power. I just hope that the old man isn't sidelined as a result in the future. Considering he mentions achieving equilibrium between them during his final battle with Arc, I'm optimistic that Zangetsu, all forms of Zangetsu, will continue to be a vital part of Ichigo moving forward. Alright guys, well that's it for the video. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope you got something of value out of it as well. And I really do appreciate it if you managed to stick with me for the entire thing. This was a pretty long one. And as always, my voice is starting to go. Once again, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you like Zangetsu? Which version of Zangetsu is your favourite? And what do you think about his story, his development, and his partnership alongside Ichigo throughout the story of Bleach? Is he one of the series' most important, most consequential characters? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. And finally, what did you think of the big twist that Zangetsu was actually Arc? How do you feel about all of my speculation in this video, my thoughts and theories surrounding the narrative? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without whom I wouldn't be able to do this. If you too love what I do here over on YouTube and you want to help support me and the channel that extra step further, thank you. By following the link in the description, supporting me for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, and by supporting me at $2 or higher, you can get every single video I release over on Patreon absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright everyone, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.